Chairman. Well, to the members of Congress, United States Senate and House, special welcome. Distinguished guests all, it is really a privilege to be here and to welcome all of you to the White House for the fourth in our series of presidential lectures. Particular greeting, of course, to Professor Wood and Mrs. Wood right here in the front row. It would be impossible to live in this house and not feel the presence of its former occupants. And that's why Barbara and I are thrilled that we will be here next year when the White House celebrates its 200th anniversary. Tonight, we honor the only president who did not live in the White House, but whose spirit thrives here and, of course, throughout our land. George Washington looks out upon us each day. His likeness has been preserved on coins and in portraits and even on Mount Rushmore. But more importantly, he shaped our very system of government. Ask any grade school student and you'll hear that we remember George Washington as the father of our country. It's been said that we consciously measure our first love against all others. In the same way, presidents measure themselves against the example set by the very first president. Each has wondered how he could be worthy of George Washington's example. We remember George Washington as a modest, dedicated man, saddled with the responsibility of shaping the most important office in this nation. He also had to carry one unique burden. He couldn't blame any problem on his predecessors. Our founders occasionally worried that the presidency could, in the wrong hands, grow into a kind of monarchy. But then they remembered the man who would define the high office, and in some ways they designed the presidency in his likeness. George Washington was shy, but decisive, reserved, but beloved. He did not seek the presidency. The office sought him. And tonight we salute him. He was a soldier, surveyor, planter, president. He enjoyed good food and wine and sports of all kinds. He married a woman who described herself as steady as a clock, busy as a bee, cheerful as a cricket. Those words somewhat remind me of the... No, I'm sorry. Most of all, George Washington embodied the values and aspirations of a special nation, one founded upon ideas and not merely planted amid the ruins of conquest or dispute. One story captures the special esteem in which Americans held him. Ben Franklin, as American Minister of France, once attended a diplomatic dinner in Paris shortly after the Battle of Yorktown. First rose a French official, I'm sure some of you had heard this, toasting Louis XVI and comparing him to the moon. The British ambassador then toasted his monarch, George III, likening him to the sun. Finally, Franklin stood up to speak, aging, and he said, "I cannot give you the sun nor the moon, but I give you George Washington, who, like Joshua of old, commanded both the sun and the moon to stand still, and both obeyed." Franklin, of course, had seen the unassuming giant in action, and George Washington led his troops into battle against the world's strongest army, and contrary to all predictions, they won. Once he said, "When liberty begins to take root, it is a plant of rapid growth." Even today, that beautiful plant blossoms in soils that had previously resisted it. George Washington's seedling has become the entire world's hope. He sought not the security of power, but the power to secure liberty. And he passed that power on to every American. And finally, he bequeathed to us a Republican model of government, staked, as he said, on the experiment entrusted to the American people. He defined the office in a defining moment of history. For 200 years, Americans have hoisted freedom's sacred flame in the chosen occupants of this office. All Americans, all presidents, derive their power from the people, but they also draw inspiration from George Washington. And now to the business at hand. Tonight, we are very privileged to have a man who will tell us of Washington and how the father of our country mastered events in times of peril. Our speaker is Gordon S. Wood, historian university professor at Brown University. He's a native of Concord, Massachusetts. You talk about springing from history's womb. He arranged that. He graduated from Tufts. He served in the Air Force, completed work at Harvard, and has been Pitt Professor of American Institutions at Cambridge University and a visiting fellow at All Souls College in Oxford. Next year, Professor Wood's newest book, The Radicals of the American Revolution, is scheduled for publication. I am sure it will complement his seminal work, The Creation of the American Republic, 1776 to 1787, and now it is my honor to introduce one of the great scholars of perhaps our greatest president, ladies and gentlemen, the distinguished historian, Dr. Gordon Wood. Welcome, sir.
Mr. President, Mrs. Bush, ladies and gentlemen. Well, as the President said, Washington did not live in this house, and he's the only one who didn't. But more than anyone else, certainly more than any other president, I think he is responsible for the house. The country began building it under his direction. Everyone wanted the house to be a much more modest affair than it is, than it resulted to be, and Washington held out for a dignified house, he said, that would stand for the presidency. He wanted it to be the largest building in America, and although this house is small by European standards at the time until up to the Civil War, it was indeed the largest house in the United States. He even predicted, against much pressure, he tried to enlarge the house, but it was made smaller, and he predicted that it would not soon be big enough. But of course, Washington is responsible for more than this house. We owe this magnificent city and its grand scale to Washington. He wanted a city appropriate to a new rising republic, and he backed L'Enfant's plan when everyone was against the irascible Frenchman. If Jefferson, for example, had had his way, Washington, D.C. would have been like a college campus, perhaps like the University of Virginia or perhaps Williamsburg. Although L'Enfant was dismissed, Washington held out for the Frenchman's plans, even though the city could only be a gleam in his eye. It is amazing when you think of it that a tiny, new, underdeveloped nation like the United States was existing on the very edges of Christendom at the end of the 18th century, conceiving of a city on this scale. And much of the credit for the grandeur of the city we owe to Washington. The city is certainly fittingly